Thank you very much. I know being on the last panel is challenging for not only the presenter but to listeners. So I hope, but I know we will do our best to keep your attention and keep the debate lively. I wanted to first thank the center for extending an invitation to present my work and sharing the work I'm doing on Tafsir, modern Tafsir on peace and conflict resolution. Also like to thank Maria for doing such a great job in getting us all here and patiently dealing with our emails and questions and so forth. What I'd like to do today is, in the next 30 minutes, to think about Tafsir, at least the Tafsir that within a framework of peace building and conflict resolution. We've been saying for the past 2 days that all of this all Tafsir has a social, political, and economic, religious situation, that the context matters. And I think the Tafsir I'm most interested in is the way Muslim scholars who've been trained in Islamic law, who've been products of Islamic seminaries, been writing and thinking about violence, terrorism, war within Muslim lands, Muslim and non-Muslim violence, Muslim violence against other Muslim minorities, etc., etc. So I like to throw out some definitions, but that's the context I'm looking at Tafsir. What are our major scholars, and I'll qualify that in a minute, what are they saying about violence? What are they saying about returning to peace and bringing harmonious relationships back to society? I think we have a good theological, philosophical, metaphysical conversation going for the past 2 days. And the 2 or 3 scholars I'll be addressing or analyzing are mainly from South Asia. And so the first definition I want us to consider is the actual term peace building. It is the framework when it means ensuring security. It means fostering nonviolent modes of resolving conflict. It means working on reconciliation. It builds upon the world of development. It works on human rights, refugees, internally displaced persons or IDPs. It basically focuses on the trauma of citizens dealing with war or conflict or displacement. So peace building is an emphasis on citizens. And within that framework, within it is a subcategory called conflict resolution. And that deals with ways that at least Muslims are, specifically Muslims, are figuring out the causes of conflict and identifying common interest for grander goals, for strengthening institutions, strengthening parties and groups for mutual engagement. So that's the framework I'm looking at this Tafsir. It's within a context of what various Muslim scholars have said. The 3 I'm looking at are Dr. Muhammad Tahir al-Qadri from Pakistan. The second one is the Grand Mufti of Pakistan, Taqi Usmani. And the third one I'm looking at is, make sure I get the name correct here, is, he's called Maulana, but Maulana Wahideen Khan, who is the Deobandi managing editor of Darul Uloom Risala, so the magazine that comes out of Darul Uloom. It's within these 3 scholars, I think, are all working within a tradition, obviously within an Islamic tradition, theological tradition, working on dealing with groups that they call rebellious, they call themselves extremists, radicals, and also groups that are fighting and destroying civilian life. The first scholar who will be visiting Washington, D.C. in about 2 weeks, Muhammad Tahir al-Qadri, he's also called in Pakistan by his followers Sheikh al-Islam, believe it or not, really wrote a historic fatwa. He calls it a fatwa. It's a 600-plus page book in Urdu, and it's translated into English. And it's on against suicide bombings and terrorism. I can't give a synopsis of this book in 30 minutes, but for about 5 minutes, I just want to outline what he thinks about the Lashkar-e-Taiba, al-Qaeda, Tariq-e-Taliban Pakistan, the Taliban party in Pakistan, the Afghan Taliban, or Shura al-Quetta, the Haqqani group, which is again another Taliban group under the Haqqani network. And he groups all of these folks as rebels. And he first groups them. He identifies them, but he then puts them in one group. And he first puts them under the label, and he only does this, as calling them the Khawarij, the rebellious groups. And it's very interesting. So instead of what other scholars do is they address the Tariq Taliban, or they address the Lashkar-e-Taiba, or they address these different groups, or whatever groups, and they deal with them individually, he lumps all of them under the rebellious historical term Khawarij. And the reason is very simple, I think, is to show that there is a historical, if not Quranic, basis for dealing with rebellions. And he's doing that too. And also, what's very interesting is that there's a linear progression of thinking about these rebellious groups. They didn't come from nowhere. The way we deal with the Taliban, al-Qaeda, is not something new, and it's not something that's out of our realm. But the Prophet Muhammad did this. After him, the caliphs did this. And after that, the imams did this, etc., etc. So his point in the first about 100 pages of this fatwa is to show the historical presence of this in Islamic history. And what he does, what's most interesting, and he spends a lot of time, is the historical documents and their statements on these Khawarij. So he points to Imam Bukhari, At-Tabari, Ghazali, Al-Arabi, Maliki, the four major schools, thinkers of Hanafi, and so forth, all the way down to al-Maqbal, who passed away in the 19th century. The point is that the rebellious groups are treated and viewed as rebellious. They're treated as stuck in a particular time. They have common characteristics. They are pious. They are also very religious in their rituals. They observe religious rituals. But the problem is that they don't understand the rituals. And they don't understand religion. And what's most interesting with his Quranic basis in understanding the contemporary Khawarij is that the way they were understood previously. And I think that's important for us, because I don't think many other scholars of his time are saying what he's saying. One, he uses the most important quote, I think, is their tendency to be idolaters. And this is an interesting stretch, but in the Quran, he quotes chapter 2, 39 to 43. And the Quran says, say to the people, listen, sincere obedience and worship is only to Allah's due, and those disbelievers who have taken idols as helpers other than Allah say in false justification of their idol worship, we worship them only that they may bring us near to Allah. Surely Allah will judge between them concerning the matter in which they differ. Certainly Allah does not give him guidance who is a liar and very ungrateful. So he's making this comparison of those idolaters of Mecca and those the idolatry thinking of the contemporary rebellious groups. And he continues to say that these Khawarij, which sometimes he just calls terrorists and so forth, that the sheer definition of their work and their contribution is really the act of having a criminal mindset. So one of the most interesting thing is, from a peace-building, conflict resolution perspective, this very important scholar, Tahir al-Qadri, is first trying to dissect the mindset as well as their superficial religious commitment. For instance, he quotes the Quran, of course, in his big, long fatwa, chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. He says, when it's said to them, do not spread disorder in the land, they say, it is we who reform. Beware, truly it is they who spread disorder, but they do not have any sense of it at all. It's in Surah Baqarah. And his interpretation is that no matter what you're listening of Tariq Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and so forth, that they are convinced of their ideology, convinced of their religious convictions, convinced of their methods and procedures, but he says they themselves have mischievous and criminal mentality, and they are the offenders, and they act as disruptors, using violence and strife. They call it jihad, but it is, or they call it jihad for reconstruction or reformation, and they presume that the tyrannous activities that they perpetrate are aimed at a good and more pious society. But the truth is, it is their inaccurate understanding of the Quran, the criminal interpretations of the Quran. They are the mischief mongers, they are the murderers, and they themselves are the tyrannous, brutal, and blasphemous, and conduct blasphemous activities. He quotes the Quran in other places too, and he says this in the beginning as well as in the end of his fatwa. He goes, basically the Quran sums up the Khawarij or contemporary rebels in this verse, which is again, this is Surah 18:104. It is those who enter struggle is wasted in worldly life, but they presume they are doing very good works. Here I think Sheikh al-Qadri is saying that the contemporary Khawarij, or the al-Qaeda types, are disillusioned by their own ideology. And this disillusionment is to establish the divine order. This disillusionment is tied to connecting deen and state together. This disillusionment is tied to legal arguments, to making the state a theocratic state. And they're content in killing, and they're content in doing wrong. And what they're doing is essentially their fundamental understanding of faith, of the past traditions, of the Prophet's Sunnah, and the Sunnah of other prophets, are all erroneous. And if you haven't got a chance to read his fatwa or listen to him, he is, I think, one of the most forthcoming contemporary scholars to speak out. And I think one of those reasons is, and I'll come to this at the end, I just want to put it out there now, is one of those reasons is many people are asking, where are the traditionally trained Islamic scholars, and where are they? How come they haven't spoken out? And I think he is one of those examples. I would like to just make another example of, within this conflict resolution paradigm, what Maulana Wahideen Khan said. And again, he is a Deobandi scholar in New Delhi, as in charge of the monthly magazine from Deoband, Darul Uloom. And what's most interesting is how he interprets what he called the extremism of Islamization. And within this conflict paradigm, he calls it folks are misled by ideologies, misled by unusual degree of ideology, that somehow something is created in your mind and it becomes a reality. In this reality, you don't contest it, you don't test it, you don't talk to anyone else, and you don't test it with others. And the first thing he does is he quotes the Quran on the story of Cain and the story of Abel, the son of the first man of Adam who killed his brother Abel. And he says, the Quran declares, on that account we ordained for the children of Israel that if anyone slew a person, unless it be for murder or for spreading mischief in his land, it would be as if he slew the whole people. And if anyone saved a life, it would be as if he saved the life of the whole people. Then although they came to them, our messengers, with clear signs, and yet after that, many of them continue to commit excesses in that land. He's comparing, in the rest of his text, he compares that these killings of innocent is not only forbidden and under God's law, and he uses that, but it's one of the most heinous crimes one can even fathom. They said that this sort of killing of others, what they see as their own interests or out of their own revenge, is increasingly a menace on our scale. And he's talking about in India, within South Asia, but also of the issues in dealing in Southeast Asia and Africa. And sometimes he mentions particular conflicts, like in Palestine or Lebanon, but in Africa he talks about, particularly after the Kenyan elections, there was post-electoral violence in Kenya. And he's saying that this sort of violence completely overlooks the distinction between innocent and others and leads to indiscriminate killings. But because ideological justification is sought to be provided for these killings, it does not investigate into the conscience of those who engage in such violence. This ideology, or an ideology of acceptance of violence, leads to people to believe that the violence is acceptable and needed, if not mandated by God, and we need to do this to perpetrate the cause of truth. And of course, he goes on to then talk about what is the ideological violence. He calls it the violence of ideology or ideological violence, depending on how you translate from Urdu. And then he goes on to then, which I love so much because of my own perspective, he loves to go on to bomb blast this organized religion into political form. So this religion was never meant to be political, and he calls political Islam or ideological Islam. So then he goes on to blast the Jamaat Islami of Hind, the Tablighi Jamaat. He goes on to talk about ideological violence of the Al-Qaeda, of the Ikhwan in Egypt. And he goes that they are so sought, they're so grounded in worldly affairs, and what he calls to the worldly evils, that they forget the basic duties of being a Muslim. And then he outlines what that is: of being kind, of feeding the poor, taking care of orphans, doing this zakat and sadaqah, of fasting, of continuous prayer, and upholding good and forbidding evil. The violence that is happening throughout the Muslim world, and he says particularly within South Asia and in Kashmir, is in the name of Islam, and it is entirely fabricated ideology to advance worldly affairs and political goals. This is according to Maulana Wahiduddin's book, Amani Alam. So again, I think there's other chapters of Surah Al-Imran, Surah Muzammal, so many other surahs that he quotes to defend what ideology was never meant to be a part of Islam. And when people think of Jamaat, a party, or a group or gathering, it was never meant to be in form of a political Islam. And I just wanted to put that out. I won't go into that at the moment, but I just wanted to point out Maulana Wahiduddin Khan's work from New Delhi. Lastly, I'd like to speak in my last 10 minutes or so. Is that right? 10 minutes? 15 minutes. Well, he'd be very happy that Taqi Osmani of the Grand Mufti of Pakistan is getting 15 minutes of my talk instead of 10 minutes. He is based in Karachi. He's also Deobandi Muslim. Probably belongs to the biggest madrasa in Pakistan. It's in Banori town, Karachi, close to 30,000, I think, 30,000 students, more. And he doesn't really give major lectures anymore. I think after 9/11 there was too much limelight put on to Deobandis as the source of all violence, of all source of increasing Taliban and promoting Taliban ideology. But before 9/11 and after 9/11, I've been able to have some conversations with him, actually taping his lectures, taping his small sermons, taping his presentations, having one-to-one conversations on what does it mean to be a Muslim for you in our world. What does it mean for many things. I think over this period of about 11 years, I've have many, many recordings, and I'm reducing it now within a framework of conflict resolution. And that's what I'd like to talk about. What's very interesting is that he has no problems with religious minorities. He doesn't have, first, he quotes over and over again, Jews and Christians are people of the book. No problems. And he teaches that we can marry, we can have relations and so forth. This is very, very common. And then I would ask him, I counter-argue him, how come your students don't understand that? Why is it a strong anti-Semitic, anti-Christian West feelings coming out of your own graduate students who go set up madrasas in Fatah, Peshawar, and so forth? He goes, that's the political, you don't understand the theology. And he tries to separate the political influences, the political or negative political influences within the Deoband madrasas or madarisas. But first, he is very clear that the Jews and Christians are part of the book, and it's unambiguous that we can marry them and I said, what about this the literature on Hindus? This is a very touchy subject, not only for the Grand Mufti, but within South Asia. What